Welcome to the Kratom Advocacy Podcast. Today, we're sitting with John Shinholser and Erin Berthold. John is the self-described recovery king, and he's opened several addiction facilities in Virginia. Is that correct, John? Why don't you tell your story a little
Well,
bit?
briefly, yeah, I'm known as a old timer in recovery. Been clean and sober, be 42 years next month, and I'm the founder, me and my wife, of the McShin Foundation in Richmond, Virginia, which is basically a national peer model, authentic recovery community organization, complete with reentry services, correctional services, sober living, community connection services. I mean, just an incredible organization that has been mirrored and modeled by hundreds of organizations and groups around the country. That's the nutshell.
And Erin, how did you work with John to develop some of his treatment plans? I've heard that you were using botanicals to address addiction. Is that the case?
Yeah, so my dissertation focused on interaction of kratom and cannabis in preclinical models of substance use and substance abuse, primarily opioid use disorder. So I was looking at combinations of cannabinoids and kratom alkaloids. And then John and I met at a kratom event and got to talking about kind of what we saw for the future of recovery, and we had a lot of the same ideas and a lot of the same drive. So,
And these treatments, mainly you use kratom to treat addiction. How did you develop the treatment plans?
Well, just
Mm-hmm.
let me add a little content here. What
Sure.
me and Dr. Bernhold what we're trying to do is open up a plant-based recovery center where we use plant-based products just as they might any other medication, FDA-approved medications. And for the last few years, like 6 years, I've been a technical advisor on another organization here in the Richmond area where they use plant-based products such as cannabis and kratom. And when Dr. Berthold came on board, she kind of gave us an opportunity to really solidify this plant-based introduction, not only as a harm reduction tool to be used at the entry level for recovery, but also as a replacement therapy instead of pharmaceuticals, replace them with these plant products. But this is in its infancy stage right now, so technically, we haven't quite launched a plant-based organization. We're still trying to raise money
Okay.
for it, but I'm really excited Dr. Bernhold's involved because that's what we needed all along was professionals to come on board with the new frontier of harm reduction and replacement therapies.
Okay. And what are the politics that you're encountering now trying to start this treatment plan? I would imagine that some people would take issue with using botanicals to treat addiction. You want to talk about like some of the challenges and the procedures that you're engaging with right now, doing that?
Well, well, you know, the sad part is that we know these products exist and they work. And you got to collect data, you got to collect science. And that's why I'm just thrilled that Erin, she's willing to put her mark on what we're trying to do moving forward. But I don't pay attention to the haters and the naysayers. I just got no time for them in my life. But Dr. Bernholt, I know she got some good input on this.
Sure.
yeah, I mean, we also see politics on the science side. So a lot of what I am getting pushed back on is how will this be better than the current, gold standard therapy, which is, medication assisted pharmacotherapy and peer support, not peer support, but counseling and things like that. And I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is change that idea and try to make everyone understand that recovery, why it's so difficult to treat substance use, is that everyone's recovery is going to look different. And the thing that might work for one person is not going to work for another person. There's so many factors involved. So it's really important for me to try to kind of decrease the stigma of using a psychoactive substance in recovery and having that be an acceptable harm reduction tool, opposed to needing it to be prescribed. And the accessibility, I think, is also very, very important. And then I was most interested in kratom because from traditional use in polysubstance users in Southeast Asia, they're able to take it immediately, right during acute withdrawal, as opposed to having to wait, which a lot of our pharmacotherapies, you have to wait until you get through acute withdrawals to then be able to take that medication. And then I don't love that the standard measure in science is, do you relapse or not, which tends to be like how they determine efficacy for a treatment, a pharmaceutical treatment. Because for me, what's more important is, if you do relapse, that's okay. But what do you do after you relapse? Do you re-engage with the recovery process? And do you still reach out to those resources that you have? So trying to kind of change some of these standards and these norms around addiction treatment, because it still is very stigmatized.
And
But
and it seems in yes, John.
yeah, what I was going to say was, you got to realize we're in a multiple pathway world right now, where anything that can possibly help or work, we want to definitely explore and try. And what we're finding out is that Kratom is an excellent entry level. And like Dr. Berthold just said, to get on Suboxone or buprenorphine, they want you to wait 48 hours and be in a terrible withdrawal situation. Man, Kratom you can take within hours or while you were using, and that buys you that 48 hours. That gives you a good engagement period with the peer support service provider, keep you motivated and in the mix. And another thing that irritates me, back to these multiple pathways, you hear everybody say, we can't arrest our way out of it. We got to throw everything at this, even the kitchen sink. Well, here we are, proven leaders in this industry with a proven track record of incredible success, and we're trying to unroll these plant-based entry-level pathways, engagement tools, and because it bumps into a special interest, big-time money industry, all of a sudden they're opposed to that. And that tells you right there what we're working with. We're working with basically a bunch of, holy smoke, monopolizing, kingpin, controlling. They don't care who they hurt or who they kill, trying to stick by their systems of care. It's almost absurd what these people are saying and doing now. They do the FDA world, the clinical world. Nobody's trying to push these folks out of business. We're just trying to add value at the entry level, at the harm reduction level, and improve, the scope and the numbers of people we can reach. Does that make
Yes,
sense, Lawrence?
yes, it does, and it seems to me, John and Aaron, that the 12-step people might be pissed at this because they would criticize you and say that, well, you're just supplanting one addiction, one drug for another, and you're going to re-enter the addiction cycle with another substance. I know that I heard that criticism about using kratom, which I don't buy, but you maybe want to talk a bit about that and what you think about that and other things, other traditional systems that you kind of are deviating from as you develop your treatment plan?
Well, let me also add, abstinent is no longer the gold standard. Okay, thanks to the buprenorphine world and the addiction doctors, the new gold standard apparently is being addicted to a pharmaceutical drug that always keeps you sort of harnessed. Now, that's got a good and a bad side to it. So, if the standard is no longer abstinent, then there's no better time in our history than to go ahead and use every tool out there. And plant-based tools will be the future, except the fact that these ASAM docs can't control it. It's kind of like a consumer choice thing. Let the consumer decide what they want to do and the route they want to take. And if the plant-based fails miserably and they still want to engage a pharmaceutical clinical world, well, it should be available. But the chicken or the egg, what comes first, shouldn't even be a discussion. Get one or the other and move forward.
Okay. And Dr. Berthold, how did you determine, or how would you determine the appropriate herbs and strains and dosages for people going through withdrawal, and how long does that treatment regimen last?
Yeah, well, I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't like officially prescribe anything, but everything that I get,
Unofficially.
yeah, where I get my information is all from what they've done in Southeast Asia. So a lot of Darshan's work, where he's looked at polysubstance users, and kind of the best advice that I continue to get from Southeast Asia is the less, the better. low and slow. John had ran kind of like a pilot project a few years back with this, and it was a few grams per day as leaf material. John was at 2, 3 times per day.
I think what we did, like 6 years ago, we did a survey. We took 30 addicts. We got them off the street. We gave them 1 week of kratom leaf and a week in a sober home just to see if they could use that to alleviate the pain associated with detoxing from fentanyl. And 29 out of 30 people were fully detoxed off of opiates after a week. And they used, I think it was 2 to 3 grams of powder up to 4 times during the course of a day. And at the end of 1 week, 29 out of 30 were no longer withdrawn from opiates. And at that point in time, they could determine, do they want to replace opiates with the kratom leaf, or do they want to stop that because 5 days of kratom leaf, you're simply not addicted to it. So just like in the old days, we used a 5-day buprenorphine step down, and they're not addicted to the buprenorphine at the end of 5 days.
Yeah, and my ideal is like what John said. I would prefer it to be a detox, that it's a certain amount over like a 5 to 7 day period. But I also am, if people want to continue on and have this be, something that they take, to keep them from coming back to a more harmful substance.
And Lawrence, keep in mind there are tens of thousands of kratom consumers all across the country that have been consuming kratom for years as a replacement product for opiates and other medications. And these folks keep it in a reasonable dosage, same dose every day. They don't have a problem with life or anything. So
And are you only using kratom, or are you exploring other herbs as well to treat addiction?
well, I'm from the old school, man. If you want to consume cannabis and stay away from that, by God, have at it. To me, that's a win. So what I'm trying to focus on is the plants, kratom, cannabis, and I'm not scared of microdosing either, or the psychedelic world. Little bit out of my realm, but I'm real open. I want to hurry up and get some intel on that.
Yeah, I mean, without psychedelic mushrooms, I probably wouldn't have stopped using that and kratom. I use kratom in the long term, and kind of psilocybin was. I tried the abstinence road and it didn't work for me. So what you're saying definitely jibes with my personal experience.
Well, you also got to keep in mind there's 40 million Americans right now. They need clinical services. However, because of the 50-year antiquated abstinence-based treatment system of care we've created, they don't even want to access it because in their mind they can't even comprehend getting off of everything. But that's why I'm saying the harm reduction space, that's the new frontier. That's how we're going to triple and quadruple our engagement and our connection to these folks by opening up the market to multiple pathways to recovery, to include plant-based. If they normalize plant-based products as an entry level into recovery and harm reduction, we will quadruple the amount of new folks we access and engage on an annual basis. So we'll go from 3 million to probably 10 million consumers a year, getting them some sort of education on recovery.
And what motivates you to do this? Do you have a personal recovery story that you could share?
Me personally? Oh
Indeed.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I got clean and sober in the Marine Corps in between my second and third deployment,
Oh,
August 10th,
wow.
1982. So I've been an abstinent guy, my entire career. Hell, I'm a banquet speaker at these 12-step, conventions and whatnot. However, this past December, being around kratom for, 6 years studying the plant, I knew I could consume low doses of it for some ailments I have. And so I started toying around with it in December. So, I'm a proud consumer of kratom. I keep it low and slow, need to consume basis. And I see nothing but, this is a pretty good product. And I haven't taken one ibuprofen since December. And I'll be sure, in the addiction world, secrets kill us. So, I share this stuff with my sponsor, my doctor, my wife. So Anybody close to me that loves me, they're fully aware of what I'm doing.
Okay, so keeping yourself accountable is really important.
100%.
What about 70H and
For in,
70H
in,
is
the, in the addiction world, one's too
yeah,
many, a
sure.
thousand never. All I was going to say in the addiction world, one's too many, a thousand never enough. So if you take any product that you can get a bump out of, you got to really be, mindful of that and pay close attention to that. But carry on with the 708 question you had. I like that.
For sure, because I know right now 70H, one of the concerns that I've heard is that it's going to destroy people's tolerance and appreciation for kratom, which might interfere with kratom's usefulness for them as a drug cessation tool. What do you have to say about that, Aaron, Dr.
Well,
Berthold or John?
yeah, Dr. Berthold, you're the expert on these
Um,
clinical things.
yeah, so 7-hydroxy, I have, I'm not a prohibitionist. So I'm not like we need to ban 7-hydroxy. I have concern that we're doing like first in human studies on actual humans who aren't consenting. Since 7-hydroxy, people are exposed to it after kratom use because it is an active metabolite of mitragynine. But taken on its own, we really don't know other than the small scale things we've done in animals, which shows us that it acts very similar to morphine. I mean, just like a personal, story. Like I've given 7-hydroxy to a rodent and I've given mitragynine, side by side. And the response you see after you give 7-hydroxy is a classic opioid response. So they get their tail goes over, kind of like a called Schwab tail. It goes over.
Swabtail.
Yeah, kind of like a little scorpion, and then they march a lot. So you just like I've just visually seen it where like you give mitragynine up to what were we giving? I think 300 mgs per kg, so very very high doses, and you never see that. You might see
That
six.
rat was high.
Yeah, yeah. So that's where the concern comes from the scientific community, and then as well as just we don't have any information. And we just know that if there is um, abuse potential and like a higher abuse potential, 7-hydroxy probably has a higher abuse potential. And for me personally, the issue I'm seeing is, at least some of the people purporting, like Heart Foundation and things like that, they're saying 7-hydroxy is going to help the opioid epidemic. And I'm like, well, how, like, what are you, where's your evidence of that? And things like it doesn't cause respiratory depression, but it does cause respiratory depression in animal models. We always see that. And we actually think that some of those really high doses of mitragynine or kratom, the respiratory depression you may see, it has a ceiling effect. And that's probably because you can only metabolize so much of that into the 7-hydroxy. So it's probably also the 7-hydroxy that's causing it after kratom consumption. So it's just, I think everybody should be free to, choose what they want, but as long as we just aren't calling it kratom, like that's my biggest thing. Is like that's not kratom, that's 7-hydroxymitragynine, that's an isolated compound, and that's a different story.
Lawrence, in a realistic, common sense world, knowing some of the data and some of the science, you got to realize 87% of the kratom consumers don't have an issue or problem with any of this stuff we're talking about. Okay, they got a level that works for them. Majority of it is either powder, the leaf form, or moderate doses of a liquid form. And it's only when you get into that other 13%, of which 3% is the addiction profile. And I think the kratom industry, they really need to take a strong look at this. There are some products out there that you get them these kids or some of these folks that have an addiction profile, and they're getting these very potent liquids of the trazodone and the 7-hydroxy that y'all are talking about. I think there definitely got to be some guardrails there. But the sad part about it is the haters and the naysayers, they're obviously going to take that to the bank and use that as their battle cry. And that's where I think the demonizing, the stigmatizing, and the felonizing is going to come from. The last thing in the world America needs is to felonize kratom consumption, especially at the leaf or the reasonable amounts of 7-hydroxy product.
Yeah,
To
and
your
I'd like
point, John.
to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Mhm, sure.
Well, I would just like
No,
to
no, please, Dr. Rowe.
yeah, onto that. One of the things that I think is, we need in the kratom space in the industry, and all of us looking at it, is a little bit more honesty. So kratom does have potential for physical dependence, and traditionally it's been used. They don't abuse it really because they drink it as a juice. You can only drink so much juice, like, so there's like limitations there. Whereas here in America, we bastardize things, we make them more strong, extra strength, powerful, most powerful on the market, things like that. And then the way that kratom is marketed as safe, it's being taken advantage of. That the leaf is generally, I'm not going to say generally recognized as safe. That's an FDA term. I don't want them coming after me. But we generally know that the leaf is quite safe. We don't really know, as John was saying, about these higher potency products. But we can hazard a guess that the more you take, the higher the chance of an issue. And so for me, it's really about the industry also recognizing that kratom's different than other dietary supplements, okay, and going above and beyond on labeling recommendations, making sure you put on there that it may be habit forming, because one of the things I'm concerned about more is a naive consumer, someone who's risk averse. So they would never go and try to touch, like a hard drug, because that's not what they're going to do. They're not going to go on the streets and, get heroin or fentanyl, or methamphetamine. They live this different lifestyle. So it's more those people I'm concerned about, who might not even know they have, this addictive personality, but then they get introduced to a substance that could potentially cause that. And I worry about those people. And that's why I take the criticism from any sort of, organizations that say, kratom is dangerous. And I want to hear all that, because we've spoken to groups, John and I, where it was an abstinence-based recovery group, and someone in the group had a dependency. And so it's really about understanding there's just not one size fits all, and then protecting individuals who have no history of substance use with a substance that has the potential for abuse.
What they're doing where I'm from is they're giving out samples of 7-OH. So I went to the Headshops and I saw they were doing this, and I tried one, and I noticed there was a total lack of like the typical antagonistic effects. That this I'm not a scientist, but there was no regulation. It just felt like right back to when I was addicted, and it ignited. I'm not saying it should be illegal. I don't think that. I'm not a prohibitionist, but it definitely reignited some of those old feelings. So it totally jives with what you two were saying about it, that there is a greater potential for addiction.
That's where the education is so important. The kratom community needs to get off their butt. They got to do realistic education. They got to create and drive the narrative, and don't leave it up to people who just don't know what they're talking about.
And can you talk about some of the special interest groups that you mentioned earlier, specifically who were taking issue with
Well,
what you're
I
doing?
mean, look, every time we go advocate for kratom, there's always an addiction doctor in there, or a pharmaceutical, person in there that's complaining. Okay, I get it. You went to college, you got a degree, you buying into the FDA, what they say. And here's another thing. Speaking of that, I've never been to a doctor yet in my entire life where they wouldn't first try to tell you about all these over the counter products to use or
Yeah.
alternatives to medicine. But try to get these guys to talk about kratom as an alternative is almost like you're asking to have sex with their dead mother or something. It's like this is nuts, man. I mean, it's like, it's just crazy. It's so obvious that they're protecting their money, they're protecting their policies and their industry, and then of course the criminal justice. You got to realize, I don't know of a jail or a prison in America where they don't want more funding, and the only way to get more funding is more customers. The only way to get more customers is more ridiculous drug laws. So this criminal justice world is chomping at the bit to felonize 20 million consumers overnight. Man, it'll be like the heydays back in the 90s when we had the largest industrial prison complex built up in the history of civilization. People want to, there's some folks out there want to make America great again with the criminal justice system, and they're tracking to do just that, and they target kratom. Kratom ain't nothing but fill up our jails, our prisons, and our courtrooms. So, I mean, we got a problem in America, multiple problems.
And would you say that you agree with the traditional assessment that addiction is a classical disease? something that I've always kind of gone back and forth about in my mind.
I think historically there's always a percent of the population that they run across their drug of choice, whatever that might be, that it's going to create a lifelong problem. And then I'm talking a drug of choice can be shopping, it can be overeating. We got the highest obesity rate in the world here in America. It can be gambling, and then obviously it can be alcohol, tobacco, sugar.
So, what would you do about, like, I don't know, cell phone addiction? Let's kind of step just for a
Oh,
second away from Kratom. How would you address that as the recovery
if you
king?
go if you if hey, if you're in a high school or
It's
any
not directed at my
school
wife,
you're
by the
in,
way.
you can't bring a phone on a school property. Come on, man. I mean, phones are the most disruptive thing, and phones have replaced number one cause of traffic accidents and death is the cell phone. So there you go. That's a classic example right there of a consumer product that's problematic to society at
That we
large.
encourage
So
that addiction. We all,
100%.
not we all, but
Look at
we all encourage it.
all the social media apps and everything. I mean, a human being ain't whole if you ain't got a cell phone getting likes on Facebook, man. I mean, it's crazy the way our world is.
Absolutely true. So let's say I enter your facility and I'm addicted to, meth or maybe crack or cocaine. Would your approach vary? Would the dose vary? How would it vary? And like, what would be the process if you had everything you wanted and needed? How would you intake me, and how would you monitor me? And can you take me through that whole process?
Well, that's what we're trying to create because I no longer work for a recovery center or an addiction center. Okay, I retired after 20 years this past December of the McShin Foundation. However, there's a couple organizations in town that I'm like the Uncle John to, So what I'm seeing, these kids come into these plant-based recovery organizations, and immediately the community will engage these kids and say, okay, look, this is what we do and this is what we consume. You know, find your sweet spot. So right now, that's what I'm trying to say, Lawrence. That's what me and Dr. Berthold are trying to do. We're trying to really formalize what these protocols are going to be, how to do this. So, you're asking questions. We ain't quite got there yet. Everything's been kind of under the radar or, backdoored. So,
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that for me, one of the most important things that I'd love to be able to identify through a program like this is who this may be best suited for. Like if we can find a demographic that this, would be helpful for or most helpful for. And that's kind of our plan is that initially upon intake, going back to your question, would be a clinical visit. To just identify, do you need to go to a hospital? Can you come through this program? And making sure that as we start to go through this, we're being very, very mindful of the fact that kratom could be a substance that they choose to abuse. So making sure we have tolerance breaks, set in. I always, when we talk to recovery groups and there's ones that use kratom, I'm like, can you stop once or twice a week and continue about your normal life? And if you can, do you? Do you need to increase your consumption? You don't. You can take the same amount every day and you're fine. Kind of similar to kind of the cannabis classical tropes of how do you determine if you have cannabis use disorder or you just use cannabis. But I'd love to be able to identify um, and kind of see if we can identify which path would work better for certain types of individuals because I'm not ever going to be here saying I think plant based is better. I just think plant based needs to be an option.
absolutely. And what me and Dr. Bernhold put together was a roadmap to really formalize and confirm through data. We have this model put together where we actually have peers engaging new people, educate, explain. We actually have an ASAM doctor prepared to do the initial clinical assessment and be their physician through the process of early recovery. We have sober houses lined up, plant-based houses lined up. We have abstinence-based recovery centers lined up. We have drivers. I mean, we got this whole model all mapped out. If we had the funding, we'd have initial data within 12 months. We'd have pretty solid data within 2 years. We'd have confirmation data within 3 to 5 years. And the sooner we get this launched and start, you know, collecting data on this stuff, the sooner we can answer all these questions, Lawrence. So there's a deliberate census amongst our national clinical world, FDA world, criminal justice world to not do this.
I wanted to ask you, Aaron. So synthetic 7-OH, is it really that dangerous? One chemist told me, well, we can't really tell the difference if it's synthetic or not. Is that bullshit?
I mean, you mean like synthetically produced 7-hydroxy versus
Yes, synthetically produced.
okay, versus like the metabolite you form in your body?
Yes.
Okay, no, there's no difference chemically. I mean, that's the same. It's the same chemical. We just don't have any safety data for 7-hydroxy taken by itself. So, like, the only data I mean, we have some preclinically, but we didn't do anything safety wise. We were just looking in models of, addiction. And so, there is no difference to me between like the compound itself, if you make it in your body, if you make it in a lab, if a compound is a compound. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. He went on to say that, well, they're worried about these large doses, yet to a regular Kratom consumer, that 7-OH is accruing in their blood. So why is that a concern? Higher doses? Don't you already have higher doses if you're consuming Kratom every day and metabolizing it into 7-OH? Or what do you have to say about that reasoning?
Yeah, I hear that. And I do have a, concern that becomes like the narrative. And that's why I tell, everyone I work with, like, who's like super anti 7-hydroxy. I'm like, well, wait, because like if you start to get us involved, us being scientists, we'll tell you that people are exposed to 7-hydroxy. But I think we don't even have enough human clinical data. And even in some of these, autopsy reports that have, kratom found or mitragynine found in the postmortem, blood or plasma or serum, not all of them report 7-hydroxy. So we just really don't know if that's playing any part. And we don't even have, like any human clinical. I mean, we have a little bit that came out of the Canadian study with what that parent to metabolite ratio is. And it's about 20%, which is what we thought from in vitro testing. But I would argue that you're taking it with mitragynine, which we know has like agonism, antagonism. You're taking it with all these
Hmm.
other compounds. And if you're taking a full kratom product, then you're taking a multitude of other compounds. So you can't say that an active metabolite is going to be the same as taking the active metabolite as an individual compound. That's completely different. But I will say it's a fascinating space to get into because most of the alkaloids have much more active metabolites, not just mitragynine. So there's so much more work we need to do with just kratom that's why it's really a big concern that they're already just like pulling out specific alkaloids when we're like whoa. We don't even know everything. Mitragynine also has another active metabolite that may or may not be more or less involved than 7-hydroxymitragynine. 7-hydroxymitragynine just got all the shine because that's the first one we found, which is unfortunate, but that's what happens in science. But there's another active metabolite that's produced in higher quantities, at least in rodents, that may account for some of the effects of mitragynine consumption. So
That's
Hey, let me
phenomenal.
let me
Totally
let
answered
me,
my question. Yes, John.
yeah, let me ask the doc a question here,
yeah,
mainly because I don't know everything. But when you take a mitragynine product and then they got full spectrum liquid
don't
products,
say full spectrum, but okay, keep
huh?
going. I know that's what they call it.
Well,
It's a marketing thing. It has a different scientific definition, but go ahead. I know what you're talking about.
okay. Well, to me, kratom leaf, it has a lot of alkaloids in there that have benefit when you consume it. But if you're just consuming the mitragynine without all the other alkaloids, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or if it's a true full spectrum, would that give you the benefits of all the alkaloids you get in the leaf.
Okay. Do you want my real opinion?
Yeah,
All right,
yeah, yeah,
okay. So
yeah.
personally, based on my research and what I've done, I don't believe that mitragynine isolated does much for pain relief or for analgesia. And I also don't think I think there's a ceiling to the potential euphoria felt after isolated mitragynine consumption. So that's why when I actually did my dissertation, the two compounds I looked at in combination for potential therapeutic were mitragynine isolated and cannabidiol. Because to me, when I'm looking at something for substance use or substance abuse, I wanted the thing that was least euphoric or had the least potential to produce euphoria. And for the cannabinoids, that's CBD, and of the alkaloids, I think that is mitragynine. So I think you will get a lot different effects, especially when you think of things about like the mood enhancement. We know that two of the alkaloids found, panantine and speciogynine, and then their metabolites, which are more active, are active at 5-HT1A or serotonin receptors, which is the receptor system subtype that's most of the approved therapeutics for depression, anxiety act on the serotonin system. And then coriantidine, which is another one that's found, has a lot of adrenergic activity, which has differential effects. And then there are some of the other ones that have more of that opioid like activity. So I do think that for things like pain, and for things like substance use, the whole plant material is going to be much more effective than an isolated compound. But if we're looking at a specific indication for a specific substance abused, I think that you could find a specific compound and isolate a specific compound that would be much more better suited to that specific disorder, as opposed to, I think, kratom itself and full spectrum kratom products can treat a variety of substance use disorders based on that polypharmacology of all of those compounds.
And that's exactly why we need to start with the data and get, many people as we can that are willing to do plant-based engagement into recovery so we can find out what products or what isolates are best for what drug that's being abused and get you the quickest outcome. So
John, you're actually going to do the rest of the interview, so keep loading up
Lauren, I have
the.
to go back. When you asked the question about is addiction a disease, you did like a little aside of like, I go back and forth. So I was interested to hear where you land on that. And then I can kind of tell you where I land too. But
me?
no, I want to hear where Lawrence lands on it.
All right.
Well, to me, it seems like a disease when I think of something like cancer or a cold. There are things you can do to ameliorate it, but with addiction, it's our response seems to vary so wildly by person. And I know you could say the same thing about diseases, but there seems to be a typical progression that's a lot more predictable as than with addiction, like which just seems so multi-directional that I don't. I'm agnostic on the question, and I haven't thought too deeply about it. But to me, what I don't like about the concept that it's a disease is that it seems to indicate like you need to surrender. Like, okay, I need this kind of treatment. Like, I have a disease. There's not much I can do. Like, whereas, well, no, you have more control over it than that. You can control its progression perhaps a little more, or maybe not. I don't know. So there's my uneducated opinion.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fair. I always see it more of a disorder, much more along the lines
For
of
sure.
like mental disorders, where it's like it's definitely should be you should be able to have insurance cover things for it. It's something that needs to you need to be able to get assistance to get treatment for it. But yeah, it's so modal, and I think you'll see that that's they tend to now say it's a brain disease. And I think that's the distinction we've started to make, because
Okay.
all brain diseases are like that, like an
A
Alzheimer,
multimodal.
a dementia,
Hmm.
it's never looks the same in anyone. So brain disease is more how I would think about it, because all brain diseases are very all over the place, because we can't, take out brains and poke them and look at them when they're functioning. So
That
I
specifies it
can
for me.
I'll help you both out here.
Oh
Addiction is
boy.
definitely a brain disease, okay? And it can create physical illnesses as well and problems. And but here's the hit. There doesn't seem to be there is some systems that you can use that will work, but that system ain't gonna be appropriate for a lot of the population. So you have to find alternative systems for the rest of the people. So for the sake of argument, it's definitely a disease, spirit, mind, body, definitely a brain disease. There's definitely some pathways you can engage on if you have the fortitude to follow through. But the problem, because you're back to the brain disease, your brain doesn't let the majority of the people do an abstinent route. It's just not going to happen. 97% of the folks relapse if they go to an abstinent based treatment center. So that's why you got to have these alternative segues into more appropriate outcomes. That's the short version. But
Yeah, I agree. And it's like kind of how I see like a depression, that's definitely a brain disease. It's something that an affliction. It can have neurotransmitters that are changed. You can have neuroplasticity, but the treatment options are never going to be the same from one individual to another. And definitely different types of treatments are going to need to be employed, whether it's pharmaceutical,
yeah, that's right.
everything.
And some pathways are perfect for some people, and they ain't never gonna work for other people. Just like some medications are perfect for some people, and some medications aren't going to work. Just like some plant-based products are going to be perfect for some people, and they're not going to be for other people. And it's just a matter of collecting data, matching them up with the profiles, the body chemistry, and all that stuff. And it takes time and willingness.
Yeah. And then Lawrence, I'd like to speak to why I'm in this work. I didn't really kind of like explain my position, I
Please
guess.
do.
I come from a background of drug users and abusers. So, I had a very significant death a little over a decade ago now, to a heroin overdose that, affected me pretty deeply, and threw me into a tailspin for a while there. But when I kind of pulled out of it, maybe about 5 years after, I was like, I need to do something to help my grief. And I decided that to help my grief would be kind of to go forward, use my brain, which I was blessed with having a brain that could function. And I also found that I was able to move between different groups of people. Like John can speak to the fact that like I can go to a recovery center and speak to, addicts, where other scientists maybe kind of can't go into that situation and feel as comfortable and be able to connect with these people and really understand. So I went back to school. I was like, I had these big dreams. I'm going to solve addiction. I'm going to come up with the best therapeutic ever. And what I found
Mm.
as I was going through it was one, of course, that doesn't work. And that's not how it is, but also that the academic space is so far removed from recovery that like I would be talking to just some people I work with. I'm like, oh, you've never seen someone overdose on heroin? Like, just to me, that's the life I grew
Mm.
up in, and that's the way that I came into things, and the perspective that I had, but that wasn't everyone's perspective in academia. And then you continue to move through the groups of the kratom industry, where some of them they're everybody's driven by money, okay, but it's like, do you really understand who would best benefit from kratom? And those might be people who aren't educated about it and are in these recovery communities where no one's really going out there and trying to educate them and explain to them that this is an option. So it just became really apparent to me that I needed to find a space where I could advocate, I could stay connected with my kind of recovery roots, and be able to help as many people as possible. I mean, I'm still trying to use it to assuage my grief over my loss. It doesn't work, but you just keep trying and trying.
Gotta stay busy. You're
Exactly.
you're you're two people who give a shit, and that's what I come away with. Like, not it's not about money at all for either of y'all. It's you clearly care, and that's a wonderful thing to see, and that's why I wanted you on my show, because I just got that impression from what little I knew of you, Dr. Berthold, and John, from what I heard of you. I also wanted to ask Erin, what's your rat's favorite drug? Is there one that he like goes bananas for?
My personal
Y-
rants, they don't
Yeah, you're no, you. Well, which don't you have like rats that do you have them at your house, or like you go to your lab, or like how does
Oh
that
no,
work?
I don't do lab work anymore. So the rats I have are brothers. I
Oh,
adopted them in
okay,
LA. They're Robin Hood, Little John, and Friar Tuck.
I see.
They've traveled
So
all
they're
over
not
the
addicts.
country. No, they're not lab rats. Their favorite snack
Okay,
is probably string cheese, though.
that's
Um,
their favorite drug.
yeah. But no, it's hard. I did a lot of my work with obviously remifentanil is all their favorites because it's not their favorite, but remifentanil is so fast acting that they've got to keep taking.
Hmm.
They push that lever for it over and over and over again.
Until they die. Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, some of the hardest ones they did. Well, no, because they can't have any after a certain point. They'll keep pushing the lever, but you just don't let them
Oh,
have
oh,
any.
I see. You cut them off. Like,
Yeah, we
yeah,
cut
you're
them
done.
off pretty quick on that one. But oxycodone was pretty bad when I did. So I would get them addicted to oxycodone, and then I would use my combinations during withdrawal. I would precipitate withdrawal. But one of the oxycodone symptoms is autophagy, so they eat themselves.
Eat themselves. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that was always a rough one. So then I'd have to like hold them while they were really high until they'd stop trying to chew on their legs because they just don't feel pain. So they're like, "Mm, and I'm like, no, 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 that's not a snack, guys. That's any opioid is really they love the opioids. But I will tell you one of the most interesting things in preclinical work, and we've started to move forward now to understand this better, is that except for like probably remifentanil, most animals will choose like a social interaction or food over most of these other drugs. So if you give them the choice of like making their friends, because rats are very social animals, or food, that's what they're going to choose more often. So we're starting in our models to use that as the test of like, abuse potential is like, are you gonna see your friend, or for relapse, like, do you want to see your friend and have that kind of community support, or do you want to take the drug as opposed to, some earlier models, which is just like vehicle versus drug. So
To clarify, how do you select the rats, and do different breeds of rats have different propensities for addiction, or drug choice, or
that has not been, I think, studied very well. So, we use rats that are pretty genetically similar. That's what we try to do because you want to try to have as close of results as possible. But I will tell you, it's another really big kind of failure in translation is that even though these animals are same genetics pretty much, they'll respond very very differently, just like naturally they have natural differences and inclinations. And we would have a group of 24, and you're going to have like half that are very friendly and half that are just very scared. So it's very very hard to standardize even animal work because you are just going to have those natural variations.
okay? And what's next for y'all? What are your immediate next steps? Things you want to promote before we end the show? Messages you want to leave the viewers with? John, would you like to go first?
Well, I think it's critical that the kratom industry, the kratom processors, the kratom consumers, I think it's just critical that they somehow unify and create the narrative for kratom. Stop letting anti and then the haters create the narrative. And then for recovery, we have got to really support these multiple pathways. It, you got to support them equally, and you know, come what is the truth, what works and what doesn't work, and we got to stop with the closed mindedness of both the recovery community, the clinical community, the criminal justice community, and the policymaker community. So, I think I think I think we got the right mix to go the right direction. But without that honesty, open mindedness, and willingness, it's going to be a clusterfuck indefinitely. So, you know, I'm trying to prevent that.
Awesome. And Aaron?
John and I need funding. So whoever's got deep pockets who's watching this, we are, we've tried, we've given, this whole
Ready to sell
spiel.
your souls.
But it's really, really difficult. The industry, at least the kratom industry, it's a slippery slope for them, right? Because they can't promote, it's they don't want to kind of be associated with that, and I understand it. So just kind of trying to find somebody with deep pockets who will get behind us. We're here, we've got the drive, we want to do this, we know we can take it where it needs to go, and we'll do it properly. But yeah, that's kind of what we're lacking at the moment.
We have a dream team ready to be put in the game, and with the funding, man, we can 5 years down the road, we'll know exactly what we're working with.
All right, Dr. Erin Berthold and John Shinholser, beautiful people, and they need money. And I wish them a lot of, I wish them a lot of success, guys. It was so great talking with you all today. This has been the Kratom Advocacy Podcast, signing out.